Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a few seconds. We're going to have a big audience here, so I'm just letting folks come in. So I will get started. Good evening. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm delighted to host tonight's program. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and all our other virtual programs. Now let me introduce our guests. Tonight we are welcoming Lisa Morton and Erin Bartram for a discussion of Calling the Spirits, Lisa's new book, which is a level-headed and entertaining history of our desire and attempts to hold conversations with the dead. Our moderator is Erin Bartram. She has been the school programs coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum since 2019. She earned her PhD at the University of Connecticut in 2015 and taught for 3 years at the University of Hartford before joining the museum. And our author is Lisa Morton. She is a writer, a 6-time winner of the Bram Stoker Award, and a world-class Halloween and paranormal expert. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat along with our guests. If you have a special or a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. And that's it from me. So please sit back and enjoy. Over to you, Erin and Lisa.
Thanks, Omar. But I'm really excited to be here and to talk with Lisa, and I know there will be a lively chat. I'm looking forward to all of your questions. Lisa, our audiences ask great questions, so hopefully we get some good ones for you tonight. I just want to start with, give you a chance to tell us what the book is about and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Erin. This is going to be fun. I'm back about 10 years ago. I had written a book called Ghost: A Haunted History for a company called Reaction Books. And so a few years ago, they came to me and they said, would you like to write a book on seances? It was actually my editor's idea. It was not mine, I have to confess. But when he brought that up, I immediately said, oh, yes, because I just thought it sounded like so much fun. And I thought I had already done a lot of the research for it, having written this global survey of ghosts throughout history. I was surprised, nonetheless, writing this book. It turned out that there was a lot I did not know about seances, about the necromancy that led up to it, and about the spiritualist movement, especially in the UK and the US in the late 19th century. It was a really, really interesting circle of people in an interesting time.
Yeah, and as we can talk about later on, the Clemenses and others in the neighborhood were in that circle. I want to start with, it's actually something from the end of your book, but I thought it was a really well expressed kind of gateway into this. You said essentially the seance, as inaugurated by the 19th century spiritualists, centered around 2 principal goals. First, to communicate with spirits of the dead, and second, to prove that such communications occurred, which I thought was really interesting to come at that part of the book, but was also a great place to start. The seance of the 19th century that you kind of discussed as the classic, in what ways was it really quite different? And did those 2 goals always exist together, or was this convergent evolution? Did one grow out of the other?
Yeah, the seance is actually unique when it comes along in 1848. We actually can put a really specific year on it. Before that, the idea of communicating with the dead was usually something that was a magical ritual and that was conducted in a solitary fashion. You were either the magician, the necromancer, who was using some kind of arcane grimoire to call up and bind this spirit, or you were the solitary seeker for knowledge or for a message from a loved one. In the Greek and Roman world, quite often you would proceed out to a cemetery and fall asleep on a grave or on a headstone to try and communicate with your loved ones. They believed that the spirit would visit you in your dreams. So again, we get a very solitary ritual, but suddenly you get up to the mid 19th century and you get these two teenage girls, Kate and Maggie Fox, and they are living with their parents in this sort of rural farmhouse near Rochester, New York. And they start hearing strange sounds coming from this rented farmhouse, and they're knocking sounds, and their parents are hearing these knocking sounds. And the girls soon discover that they can communicate with these sounds. They can ask questions, and the raps will knock a certain number of times and answer. And it reaches the point where they can lay out the letters of the alphabet on a table, point at each one, and whichever one gets a knock, they know that the spirit is trying to spell something out. Well, word of this gets out. Within a few weeks, hundreds of people are showing up at this farmhouse. They want a look at this amazing thing that's happening. The girls have an older sister named Leah, and Leah lives in Rochester, and she brings Katie and Maggie to live with her. And she starts to charge for their services. So now she's bringing people in, she's charging them, she's sitting them around her big dining room table. Kate and Maggie are at the end of the table. And this is where the seance is born, this idea that a group of people are gathered together to witness this sort of miraculous communication with spirits.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about it as this turning point between the old and the new, because it starts as a really place-based experience. You know, the original thing is there's a guy who was murdered and he was in the basement and he was the guy. That it starts as kind of drawing on those older ideas of, and I think the way we think about hauntings and stuff today, that things are tied to a place where something happened. But really quickly, it starts going in all kinds of different directions. And what you effectively outline is how a new religion has its battles over what its orthodoxy are going to be. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about some of the ways that the people who get involved in this movement have real differences of opinion about how it should proceed in the seance room and how it should proceed as a social movement.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, there are many interesting things about spiritualism, but it was interesting that it was definitely almost a very progressive movement right from the start. When it was in Rochester, there was also the abolitionist movement was somewhat seated there. The girls, Katie and Maggie, the Fox sisters, actually knew Frederick Douglass, which is still amazing to me. I think he may even have attended some of their performances and was a believer in what they were doing. And there was this idea that soon began to spread that anyone could practice mediumship. That was part of the sort of egalitarian idea behind this. One of the things I find interesting about it, though, is how often the major mediums were women. And I think that there is a definite reason for that, which is that being a medium, and you could make a very good living at this, was a very attractive alternative to a lot of women considering their options in the mid 19th century. They were kind of had the choice of being a mother and a wife, maybe working as a domestic in a factory. There wasn't much else offered to them. So you can imagine that if you were a somewhat perhaps flamboyant person who liked the idea of being part of these big groups, giving these performances, this would have been a really nice alternative to your other choices for pursuing your life. And the women who did go into it and who became very successful at it, I suspect were gifted performers. They were probably very charismatic. We have photos of some of them. They tended to be somewhat attractive quite often. And they certainly played on that. I always say there is also an erotic element to the seance because you often have these attractive young female mediums leading a group of people in a dark room where they're all pressed together and this miraculous thing seems to be happening. And we probably should also stress right off the bat that people nowadays tend to think of a seance as something that's very scary and dark and sinister forces being unleashed. And that's what we've gotten from decades of horror movies. But if you read accounts from the 19th century, the seances were one part party, one part magic show, one part revivalist meeting. They were joyful. They always began with singing, and they usually were a group of friends or several groups of friends who were gathered together, and these things would happen that they completely accepted as being real. And by the time the evening was over, you would see them saying, that was the most wondrous evening of my life. So these were really extraordinary events to the people who were part of it at the time.
That's interesting. I hadn't really made that connection, because one of the other, you mentioned what are the few options that women have. One of the options that a woman can have to avoid the trauma of marriage and childbirth is actually becoming a religious woman, becoming a nun. And for many working class women, that is a way to go to get an education and have an income. And to think of this as another essentially religious path for these women is something really remarkable. And there is a long tradition of this idea that sort of women are more connected. I think Cotton Mather was basically like, every woman knows before childbirth that she's, has a high likelihood of dying, and it makes women more connected to this kind of stuff. So whether that's true or not, it's certainly the groundwork was laid there. I wonder if you can talk about, because we were talking before, like this is actually such a 19th century thing, that this draws on so many other different traditions. And you talked about, everyone gets together and really believes this. It's interesting that this it didn't go from being a very serious religious thing to a silly parlor game. In fact, like the Phantasmagoria, which everyone thought of as entertainment, came first, and then this happened. So I wonder if you can just talk about some of the different influences or sort of streams of culture that come into this moment in 1848, which is like the greatest year of the 19th century. Everything happened.
It was definitely a time when everything was in flux. The Industrial Revolution had led to these incredible changes, and people were now living in cities more than ever, and they're surrounded by factories, and everything from the clothes they wear to the ships they sail on have changed dramatically. Their religions are changing, and you get in the late 18th century, there was a movement that came up called mesmerism. And when people hear that word, they think immediately hypnotism, because it's become synonymous. But in the 18th century, it was very different. It was more of a healing belief. Franz Mesmer was a guy who believed that the human body had these magnetic poles, and that when you got sick, it's because the poles were out of alignment. And he thought he knew how to align these poles. And it involved these very strange things where you would get into a tub and hold on to these iron rods. And the mesmerism healing stuff was often done in a group. So you had a little bit of that group communal thing going on with mesmerism. And it's interesting that the first time we see the word seance applied to a group that is not a political body, because it actually sprang out of political meetings, was in reference to mesmerist meetings. And mesmerism, it kind of catches on outside of continental Europe, but when spiritualism comes along in, say, 2 years after the Fox sisters began, 1850, it's immediately, I think, far more attractive than mesmerism. For one thing, it does have that more egalitarian idea that anyone can do this, anyone can be part of this. And of course, it also offers this tremendous comfort, this sort of fulfilling this sort of deep spiritual need that a lot of people were having at that point. People were feeling abandoned spiritually by all of this vast technology that was happening around them, and they were looking for something to cling on to in that regard. And this gave them a wonderful belief system that they could talk to their deceased loved ones, that they could communicate with them, that they could actually witness them in making contact in some sense, in terms of the table was tipping, there were knockings on the walls. So it certainly, I think you can see why it was the right thing at the right place at the right time. And it really fulfilled a need for a lot of people then.
Yeah, and the idea that it is, I was wondering about this sort of egalitarian, anyone can do it, because there is also the incentive to make this, oh no, it's an exclusive thing that you need to pay me to do, but that there were spiritualist schools was really interesting to me and in all of this. You know, I just imagine like a correspondence course to learn how to tap into, you know, to the inner eye. Um, and I think it's important that we establish that we are talking about this as a real religion, and that like even people who are doing these weird charlatan shows are also believers, because in fact that happens even now, that you'll fake the miracle because you believe so much that it should be true. But obviously, I think one thing that people are obviously really interested in is beyond the levitating tables. If you can talk about some of the different ways that some of these more famous mediums put on their performances, and in fact seem to like try to distinguish themselves from other people.
Yeah, many of the mediums had their own kind of little particular thing that they did that no one else really did. One of the most famous mediums, in fact, probably the single most famous of the Victorian spiritualist mediums, was a man, and a fellow who was Scottish American named Daniel Dunglas Home. And Mr. Hume had some really peculiar talents. His followers claimed that he could lengthen his body at will. Now, it seems fairly apparent that Hume probably had some ways of dislocating his shoulders, that kind of thing, but he was obviously very charismatic and a very skilled performer who could convince people of what he was doing. He was also famed for his levitations. And here we have a pretty good idea of what he would do. He would remove his shoes during the seance. And he apparently had specially constructed shoes that allowed him to slip out of them quickly and easily. And he would bring his legs up to the chair. And remember, you're in an almost totally dark room. It's during gas lighting. So the gas light is very, very dim. The gas has been turned down. You can see just enough to get an idea of what's happening. So with Hume, what he would do is he pulls his legs up into the chair, and then he slowly stands up in the chair. Now, in a dark room, it looks like he's rising, but where he's really selling it is in telling everyone that he's rising. I'm floating now. I'm above the table. I'm reaching for the ceiling. That absolutely convinced people. He also likely had a telescoping rod with a pencil attached to it. So in the semi-darkness, he's pulling this out of a pocket, expanding it, and he marks the ceiling with the pencil. And then when they complete the seance and turn the lights on, he can point at the mark on the ceiling and say, there's proof that I floated up and marked the ceiling right there. So that was his particular thing. One of my favorites was a woman named Agnes Guppy, and Mrs. Guppy was famous for an ability called apporting. That's Apport, and apporting meant that she could make objects materialize seemingly out of nowhere in front of people. And so she would hold a seance, and in the dark, she might ask everyone around the table to name their favorite fruit. And when the lights would go up, they would discover the fruits on the table before them. She apported some very strange things, including herself, according to one story. But my personal favorite was the man who reported that she caused live eels to appear in his lap during a seance. Then, of course, we get into those who claim to be able to produce full body manifestations of their spirit guide. And the most famous example of that, I think, was Florence Cook. And Florence Cook was a teenage medium in London who had a spirit guide named Katie King. And the way Florence's seances worked was that she would go into something they called a spirit cabinet, which was really just another part of the room that was curtained off or separated somehow. The lights would go down and people would sing. And the singing, by the way, served two purposes. On the outside, it looked like it was just a way to make people more convivial and join together. It was probably also covering the noise of what the medium was doing, though. So Florence is in the spirit cabinet. A few minutes later, Katie King emerges and moves among the crowd. She's dressed in a white veil. She's got this elaborate white headdress on. Now, the fact that she happens to bear an astonishing resemblance to Florence doesn't seem to deter people. The most amazing thing about Florence's story is that she was examined for 6 months by a very famous scientist at the time named William Crookes. He would go on to be knighted for his contributions to science. He was an avid spiritualist, and he tested many of the leading mediums of the day, including Hume. He had tested Hume. He tested Florence, and he confirmed all of them. He would put them through elaborate tests and end up saying, "Oh no, their abilities are absolutely earnest and real." And with Florence, he produced a series of early photographs of Katie King, the spirit, including one in which he is arm in arm with the spirit. And later on, like decades later on, someone who had known Florence said that Florence had confessed to them that she was having an affair with William Crookes. She had spent 6 months in his house with him while he was testing her, while his wife and 6 children were also living in the house. So that makes a little bit more sense, because Crookes did endanger his reputation by trying to stand up for Florence. He managed to survive that, went on to be knighted, but it caused quite a controversy at the time, even without people knowing about any sort of possible affair.
Yeah, and that kind of gets us to a question I was going to ask, and someone in the chat just asked about Houdini. I wonder if you can talk about the different, not necessarily the specific people, but the different occupation types that were called on to confirm or debunk this, often, the same kind of person. What are these sort of kinds of people who are supposed to be able to tell us the truth? You obviously talked about journalists, but there are some others.
Magicians were the classic debunkers. And even before Houdini, there was a very famous British magician named J.N. Maskelyne, and he loved to debunk the mediums. However, when he finally went to court for one, he lost, which was astonishing. He was sued when he tried to say that a medium named Reverend Monk had been doing nothing but a magic act when he produced this ectoplasm, which was supposed to be this matter of the spirits that a medium could exude. And Monk did seances where he apparently produced this whitish, filmy material from his torso. And Maskelyne went to court as he was being sued, and he said, "Oh, I can do that." And he invited the jury to one of his magic performances, and he did it on stage. Where he lost was that the other lawyer said, "Well, yes, you produced it, but Monk can also make it go back into his body, and you didn't do that." So Maskelyne lost that case. But Houdini was, of course, the most famous of the debunkers. He wrote a very famous book in 1924 called A Magician Among the Spirits, which was like his debunking Bible. And the thing that's interesting about Houdini is he desperately wanted to believe. He wanted to find a real medium because he was so devoted to his mother. He called his mother "my sainted mother" in all of his correspondence. And he really was obsessed with his mother his whole life. And he would love to have found a medium who could put him in touch with his mother. And he never found it. And it made him kind of bitter. And so that's one of the reasons he was such an active debunker.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of my favorite little nuggets in this, that the way that spiritualism, despite its controversies with, obviously, with the Catholic Church and also, the witch trials, those are Protestants. Like there's a lot of stuff here, but that it still largely fits within a Christian framework. And that he noted that, like, my mother, who doesn't speak English and is Jewish, was somehow summoned by someone calling her in English and making the sign of the cross.
Right.
That these that you can see it has all the trappings that will work for, as you've said, people who very much want to believe this. Most people are going into this wanting to have that experience. The same way, that someone theoretically doesn't go to a haunted house just to be like, I can see the lever and whatever. You want to get into the spirit of the thing. And I thought that was fascinating that you you didn't do all of his tricks, so technically you didn't really debunk him.
Right.
Was really interesting, but it was kind of cool to see the way that the way that this movement fit with a lot of other emerging sciences at the time. Just this desire to understand invisible forces in the world, and to talk about Arthur Conan Doyle he says that he went from orthodoxy to materialism, and materialism to the spiritual world. The idea that we're throwing away this old world of materialism, which barely even existed, period. But you've got psychologists and physicists. And so I wonder if you can talk a little about the general metaphysical vibes of the period.
Yeah, materialism was a philosophical belief
Yeah.
that had been prevalent during the Enlightenment. And a lot of people didn't like materialism, especially as they got further into the 19th century. They felt like it was cold and that it didn't really touch them in any way. And that was all part of what was attractive to them about spiritualism. They also were not tremendously fond of traditional Catholic Church or the Church of England, which they felt was very too many strictures, that kind of thing. So spiritualism again was a little bit more progressive than that. And by the way, when we talk about Conan Doyle, we should mention that my favorite relationship in the entire history of seances is that between Conan Doyle and Houdini, which is an amazing and very sad, finally, relationship, because they start as friends who have a tremendous admiration for each other. I mean, Houdini loved Conan Doyle so much, he had a special little box, a little velvet lined box that he kept Conan Doyle's letters in. But when you mentioned the producing these pages of writing, which were supposedly from Houdini's mother and so forth, that was Conan Doyle's wife who did that.
Yeah.
And that moment during that seance when Houdini saw these pages was so infuriating to him that it ended their friendship instantly. And they became bitter rivals. And in fact, when Houdini published A Magician Among the Spirits, he sent a copy to Conan Doyle, and Conan Doyle scrawled across the title page, "A malicious book." And the two of them throughout the remaining years of their lives would often be touring in the same cities at the same time. So one night you might go to the theater and see Conan Doyle lecturing on the marvels of spiritualism. And the next night there's Houdini on the same stage saying, "Conan Doyle is wrong. I'm going to show you how it's really done." They had such an interesting, starts as a friendship, a really loving, intense friendship, and ends in this terrible feud. And I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of gets to one of these, you start with all of the different reasons that people have tried to contact the spirit world, and then that the fundamental challenge in some way with the church writ large, Catholic and Protestant, is essentially, why would anyone want to come back from heaven to talk to you? And nobody should be able to get out of hell to come talk to you. And I actually was sort of wondering whether you can see a spot in there for Catholics that purgatory might be the place where people can slip out. But when you get to the 19th century, this is not Odysseus sacrificing to call up Tiresias again. I wonder if you could talk a bit about who people want to talk to. Is it just, I want to contact family, I want that proof? Or is it you take who you get? It's going to be some rando telling you whatever they want to tell you.
I think that kind of varied even almost from medium to medium. I mean, when the Fox sisters started out, it didn't seem to be about contacting your dad or your great uncle or whatever. they were just conveying messages from the beyond. And as you mentioned earlier, there was, when they started in their farmhouse, there was this belief that they were actually getting messages from the spirit of a man who had been murdered in the house and his body buried in the basement. And they even went so far as to bring in a team to try and dig that basement up. And what they found apparently was a horse's head or skull down there. But some of the mediums, it almost gets a little bit into the difference between the two types of mediums, the trance mediums and the physical mediums. The physical mediums were the ones who produced things you could see or hear or even touch or smell or whatever. So if you went to a physical medium, you were expecting to be astounded by seeing these things, these floating globs of light, or hearing these pounding noises, or seeing an accordion float into the air and play by itself. If you went to more of a trance medium, you were expecting to receive communications, and probably from someone that you wanted to hear from. The mediums, the trance mediums, would usually do a little bit of a cold reading process. And cold reading is, by the way, a lot of people have a slightly wrong misconception of what cold reading is. They think it's, oh, you're skilled at looking at someone's face. And so, no, it's much more deliberate than that. Cold reading is that technique that starts with, I'm getting someone in the house who has a relative whose name begins with H. You know, there's always going to be someone in a group of 20 people who can come up with something. And if not, then, oh, maybe it's an R. Yes, it's an R. And you keep asking questions that narrow it down and down and down and down until you are getting to something very specific. Okay, it's your Uncle Randy, and we know he liked the color red. And did he carry a handkerchief with him? And so at that point, it seems like the medium has come up with an amazing bit of information. Really, they have just asked the right questions. And again, this gets into, what do you want to believe? Do you want to believe that that's Uncle Randy who's giving them that information? Many people find great comfort and solace from that, which is, I think, one of the reasons that it has persisted and been so popular throughout the ages.
Yeah, that in fact is sounds very much like some of Sam Clemens' humorous writings from his very, very early career. And a bit that he uses a lot is, telling the medium, oh, I want to find out what happened to my friend, John Smith. And he's like, and hundreds of raps came in as every John Smith, in the area started to communicate. But he also has a bit where it's just, we're going through the list of, did you die in this way? Were you stabbed? Were you shot? Were you hung? Like trying to find this, and he's going to kind of the rapping medium. Someone brought up in the chat, and I think it's a good thing to think about. We can talk about the Ouija board and the planchette, and how all of the Fox Sisters alphabet thing kind of comes in, and it kind of also gets at a question I had, which is, where do writing mediums fit in? Because I know the original planchette was sort of like, oh, this will write, and then they were like, that's really hard to read this. What if we just had the letters?
Yeah, the original, there were planchettes that actually had little pencils stuck through the center of them, and you would put it down on a sheet of paper and it would write out things that were indeed very difficult to read. There was also slate writing, which was popular for a time. The idea with slate writing was that the medium would write down messages on a little blackboard, a little slate with a piece of chalk. And there were several mediums who were very skilled for their slate writing. Later on, it was discovered that they had very ingenious slates constructed because it would usually consist of them putting two slates together. And then when they pulled the slates apart, there were messages on them. And that was a classic magician's trick where there was like a little sliding thing between the two slates. And so, but automatic writing was something that, comes about and is believed to be a genuine skill that some mediums possessed. And it was something that not every medium did, but some did indeed specialize in it. It was, for example, what Conan Doyle's wife wanted to pursue. And the idea there, of course, was that the medium enters a trance state and allows themselves to be taken over by a spirit that is writing down these messages. And yeah, automatic writing is one of those subjects that I suspect is done in earnest. I suspect it's more often something that the medium really believes they are doing rather than something that is committed in a fraudulent way. I actually do believe that Mrs. Conan Doyle thought she was probably really channeling something from Houdini's mother, but
well, and it's, I mean, it's not that different from glossolalia and all of these other movements of speaking in tongues. And that's the thing, that all of these things fit within a framework of what is an understood spiritual belief kind of in the 19th century.
Right.
Yeah, we're focusing a lot on the 19th century, but I will say the book, there's tons of stuff on kind of what came before, lots of stuff on what comes after. Feel free to drop in the chat. I mean, your favorite weird seance scene. I was really pleased to see Madame Blavatsky show up in here because she's one of my favorite weirdos, but it did make me, my two favorite seance scenes, which were not mentioned here, which are super weird. Madame Bolkonsky from Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, who's clearly a Madame Blavatsky ripoff, who's doing the post-World War I spiel, and then the incredible seance episode of Doctor Who where Charles Dickens is involved, and it's all about his sort of skepticism and stuff like that. So I feel like we see a lot of depictions of the horrible seance and a lot of the debunking seance, and not necessarily very much of what this practice actually looks like in real life for people, and how very, very popular it was.
Yeah, exactly. That in fact is how I open the book. I compare a classic sort of horrific seance scene, and I chose Penny Dreadful for that, which mainly because I had just watched it when I was writing that chapter. But I mean, in Penny Dreadful, you have the medium being possessed and winds blowing and the people levitating. It's crazy stuff. And in reality, it was, and then I compare that to an actual eyewitness account, first person, that I pulled out of a spiritualist newspaper about what a wonderful thing it was. And by the time you get into the 20th century, it has definitely changed. And the reason for that is that the mediums were so often debunked throughout the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
The final stake through its heart was kind of 1888 when Maggie Fox came out and confessed it was all fraud. The Fox sisters, it turned out, possessed an astonishing ability to crack their toes very loudly. This was a genetic predisposition that they had honed into this amazing skill. It was so loud that people in auditoriums could hear it. And Maggie and Katie both confessed that it was all fraud. Their lives ended somewhat tragically. They both died mainly of alcoholism, impoverished. Maggie gave an incredibly sad interview near the end of her life in which she talked about how she tried to communicate with spirits. She would go out to graveyards at night, sit on tombs and pray that something would reach out to her, and nothing ever did. And that kind of, along with a commission that had been held about the same time that had finally said there is no proof that there's genuine mediumship, that sent spiritualism back, but it didn't kill it entirely. It transformed a little bit more into the sort of odd ectoplasm producing things, and then World War I happens, and World War I is such a massive global trauma that many people are turning to things like spiritualism and Ouija boards in a desperate attempt to find some sort of closure, because so many people lost a son or a husband or a brother in this war, and quite often lost them in a way that they didn't know what had happened to them, if they were even really dead. So you can see again the attraction of something like the Ouija board at this point, which is a device that you can use in your own home without having to bring an outsider in. You can sit down with your family and you can try to reach out to your son or your brother. And this is also when the trance mediums really start to take over completely. The physical mediums have all been debunked at this point. The trance mediums are coming along and they are saying, I have a message from your son. Now, if you are grieving your son, that is a really startling thing to get. And again, it was something that you can understand why people found great comfort from that.
Yeah, and that's why we're seeing the questions pop up like, is it real? Are you a believer? All these things. And also, how can people be allowed to say this if it's not true? I think we can talk about all those things, but I think, in fact, thinking about this as a religion is an important part of understanding the persistence of these things. And I love an incredible name, Mother Leafy Anderson. One thing that was, Lisa talks about the development of sort of an African-American offshoot of this, and that these spiritualist churches, many of them were lost in Hurricane Katrina. Like the persistence of some of this was really striking to me.
Yeah, as often is the case with history, the sort of non-white contributions get overlooked. I tried not to do that. And Mother Leafy Anderson was an amazing woman who founded, she had been brought up wanting to believe in spiritualism. This is like the end of the 19th century. She had trouble finding spiritualist churches in her area that would let her as a Black woman participate. Segregation was still alive and well. So she ended up leaving the North and coming down south to New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And New Orleans had such a tradition of voodoo and hoodoo and things like that, that she was able to set up her spiritualist church there. And she not only set up her church, she set up like a national union of Black spiritualists, and she really paved the way for an amazing expansion of spiritualist and churches and so forth across the country that were devoted to their Black believers. Mm-hmm. And she was also obviously very smart and very gifted. At one point, she was arrested in New Orleans, and she got out of the arrest and the trial by telling the judge things about himself that they thought she could not possibly have known. So she was one who actually did prove her abilities in court.
Yeah, and she the one who was like, you can't say like Jesus was just another guy who was a vessel for a spirit.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Jason had messaged us something, and it kind of actually gets us back to one of the other progressive causes that spiritualists tend to be aligned with. He was asking whether spiritualists believe that animals had souls, and could people try to contact a beloved pet?
I never came across an example in the 19th century of any of the mediums trying to call up a pet. I actually don't doubt that it happened, because indeed the spiritualist movement was deeply aligned with the anti-vivisectionist movement at the time, which would now be our animal abuse movement. And among the many progressive causes they were aligned with were labor and abolition and anti-vivisectionist movement. So I have no doubt that they certainly held animals in high esteem and probably did believe that they had souls, but I have never seen an account of one being brought up in a seance.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right. Oh, see, now all of a sudden people have lots of questions, which are good. And yes, I'll just verify this for everyone. I don't know that the link will go out to everyone, but all of our virtual programs are recorded. They're all on the Mark Twain House programming website, which I think Omar put in the chat. Anything that you've seen that's been virtual, you can pretty much see online now. Let's see, what else do we have here? So someone asked, and I'm guessing the answer is yes, have you been to Lilydale?
I have not.
Okay.
I'm dying to go. I live in LA, and I don't travel as much as I would like to. I would love to go to Lilydale. It's completely on my bucket list. I've also never been to Salem. So those are, and the Mark Twain House, which I have written about the Mark Twain House in some of my Ghost Report kind of things. And so they're all destinations for me if I can ever get back to the East Coast again.
Yes, and Lilydale, you describe it as essentially like the spiritualist capital in New York, which now is on my list of places to go to. Let's see, what else do we have in here? So someone did ask, are there records of the seances that Sam and Livy used to try to contact Susie after she died? It might be a good time to at least drop in addition to his kind of glib Sam Clemens making fun of spiritualists, Sam did contact some, or he visited some mediums. He visited a writing medium in New York, who eventually becomes a character in Life on the Mississippi. I'll drop in the link for you so that you can read that bit. Who is actually sort of right in the thick of all of the people that you're writing about. He and Livy do attend a seance held by Isabella Beecher Hooker, who lives down the street, who's sort of one of the leaders of the intellectual circle that they're in, and he doesn't like Isabella for a variety of reasons. She's also an ardent feminist, make of that what you will. But there are these later seances, and I was like, at the end of the day today, I was like, where are the records? What do we have? Like, what can I? And I was completely alone in the servants' wing, and I was desperately trying to find these records. And then there was a large crash in the next room, and nothing fell. So I don't know what that was. But I will sort of drop in the chat some of Sam's own writings about this kind of stuff. But I did want to emphasize to people that there is one area he really does believe in. It's what he calls mental telegraphy, the idea of sort of thought transference across time and space. And he is a member of the Society for Psychical Research, and particularly wants this idea studied, which is not the same as what we're talking about. But he, it's that thing where people will be like, well, I'll believe in this, but not this other thing. And really, you write a lot of letters to a lot of people. Sometimes they're also thinking about the same thing you're thinking about because they're your friend and they're in correspondence with them. But he is, I think he would fall in that same category of Houdini, the desperate to believe thing. And I think that applies not just to his views about seances and spiritualism, but his views of religion in general, which is not necessarily the way people want to think about him. For a lot of people, he needs to be this skeptical, doubting person all the time. I think there's a real desire to know, and in his case, probably to get some absolution. One of the most heartbreaking things is he writes, as he knows that his wife and daughter are going home to Hartford, where he knows his other daughter has already died, and they're going to get there and find this out. He says something like, if I could only have one more day with her, I know I'd still kind of just be a jerk. Like, I probably wouldn't get any better, which is like, that's kind of not enough. But that desire to get some kind of forgiveness from those that have gone, I think, is a real part of what Sam is interested in. One thing that irks me, because we have lots of ghost hunters come and do things, and one thing that always, it makes me upset, because like, these are people that we know. We work in their house. When people try to call out, and I remember seeing a video of someone going, Susie Twain, maybe if you called her by her actual name, she would come out. Twain wasn't her last name. So I think that's just an interesting thing to me, that like, you can sort of see why Houdini would be so, to think you've been sold a pup and it plays with this honored memory of this person who you desperately want to talk to. You can see why it would just be absolutely infuriating and heartbreaking if you really wanted this. And
yeah,
instead
absolutely.
You've been given this other thing that makes a mockery of what you want.
And by the way, the mental telegraphy thing did have an odd connection to seances.
Yeah.
When the Society for Psychical Research was formed in 1882 over in London, and then set up an American branch soon after, their first big project was a 2-volume book they ended up publishing in 1888 called Phantasms of the Living. And one of the things that they were investigating at the time was the theory that mediums were not communicating with the spirits of the dead, but were reading the thoughts of the people sitting at the table. So if the medium was saying, oh, your Uncle Bob loved the color blue, they're actually reading that from the person who is missing Uncle Bob, not getting it from a spirit out here. And the society spent decades on that theory, researching that and trying to prove the existence of what we now know as ESP, or telepathy. And mental telegraphy was one of the terms that they used at the time.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, because it does bring up something. Someone asked about Mary Todd Lincoln and seances in the White House, but that spirit photography is one of the things you talk about, until people start to be like, wait, that looks like somebody else who I know, or the who left the fingerprint in the wax, and then it's like, oh, it's our dentist. That in some ways these things only work in a society that's busy enough that you don't know everybody who might show up. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Mary Todd Lincoln, because she does get a discussion in here, and there's a great image in here.
Yeah, the Mary Todd Lincoln, and she and Abraham had lost a child. She was very interested in spiritualism, partly because of this child. And no one's quite sure where Lincoln really stood on it. There is speculation both ways that he may actually have been a spiritualist believer, but the general consensus is he probably wasn't. But Mary Todd was, and after his passing, she went to see a very famous spirit photographer named William Mumler. And Mumler set her down in the chair. And again, it depends on which version of the history you believe. In some, Mumler had no idea who she was when he brought her into the studio, and others he did know. In either case, he takes the photograph of her, and the photograph is processed and appears to show Mary Todd with Abe's spirit right behind her. And it has been a somewhat controversial photo for decades, for centuries, I guess now. And it seems likely that Mumler probably had a plate of Abraham Lincoln, that he did indeed know who she was, that she was coming, that he had the plate ready. And what he probably did, his method of creating these spirit photos was to insert a plate, an existing plate, in with the one that he was taking the picture on, and creating a sort of double exposure image. And he probably had a library of hundreds and hundreds of plates. Quite often, the person that would show up in the background of the photo, someone would look at it and go, well, that doesn't look like anyone I know. Or it kind of looks like grandma, but not, I don't know. Mumler was so popular for a while that he actually sold spirit photographs by mail order, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. How that could work, I don't quite know. But he actually did end up going to trial, and he was found not guilty. So
yeah, there's so many other good questions. I'm hoping that we can. Okay, so this one actually gets to something that I think you can talk a bit at length about. Some people have asked about other traditions. Judy asked, did you do research on, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly, Dybbuk's in the Jewish religion? You actually have a really interesting chapter towards the end that puts this in global context and actually talks about what is really distinct about seances. I wonder if you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, the seance, the sort of group gathering about to call up a spirit, is very Western. I didn't find huge examples of that in any other culture. In terms of Dybbuk's, I actually covered Dybbuk's in my other book, Ghost to Haunted History.
Okay, I'm glad I didn't just miss that in here. Okay.
Right. They are not in this book, they're in the other one. But yeah, the seance, the whole idea of the group sitting down together, is just really kind of unique. It doesn't really happen earlier than 1848. It doesn't really happen other places in the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that a lot of the other non-Western and really non-American and European versions that you cover bear much more resemblance to some of the things you talk about in the beginning of the book from the ancient world, kind of through the early modern period, that are much more like this. That this seems like a very uniquely 19th century, the dislocations of urban capitalism and all of this kind of stuff has produced that. And it made me sort of think that, like, you know, it's sort of an odd relationship, but, you know, people tend to think sort of things were bad and they got better. And it means that often people will miss that things like treatment of mental health in the early 19th century was actually kinder than in the later 19th century. And that one of the things that shapes that is the disruption. You no longer know the people in community and care for them. And thinking that all of a sudden the seance, where it's not bound to a place anymore, you know, that your loved one died in Flanders Field or in the big city where they moved away, that this is really a way to maybe still have contact with the spirit world that doesn't depend on you being able to go and sit on that person's grave, you know, like Megan Fox really wanted to. And that is a thing. I think prophecy is sort of another thing that's related to this. And if folks know one story about Sam Clemens, it's that he had a dream of his brother's death the night before it happens. You know, his brother dies when the boiler on a steamship explodes, a job that Sam got for his brother, and that he is effectively, there's a cat behind you, that he effectively, you know, envisions this happening. And what I thought was notable was that these aren't necessarily like looking for prophecies, although that some of the New Age seances that you talk about is really explicitly about calling up not someone you know, but some specific master who is gone, who can teach you new approaches to your own religion.
You're right. Yeah, I have a theory that spiritualism kind of branched off into two directions in the mid 20th century. And on the one hand, that belief that it could be scientifically proven gave us the modern paranormal investigation. And then on the other hand, the trance mediums who are communicating with the spirits gave us the modern psychics. And yes, this modern psychic will often come up with that prophecy or come up with that knowledge, I know where the dead child's body is buried kind of thing.
Yeah, that is interesting. Sort of both what are people asking of spirits and what are spirits offering in different moments. I hadn't thought of this. The X-Files spirit of I want to believe sort of pervades this, but thinking about one of the classic episodes, Clyde Brookman's Final Repose, which is that all that he can see is how people die. That's the only bit of foresight that he has. And in fact, Dr. Brown, who I'm guessing is probably Wesley Brown, as I see the list of participants and I start to learn people's names, asked about really the relationship between psychology and parapsychology. I was pleased to see Peter Venkman get a momentary mention in here, but psychology is another discipline that is emerging in this period, and William James plays a large role in this. But also like, just because this stuff has been debunked, there's still something here to investigate. We should be doing this work. So I wonder if you can talk about the relationship between those disciplines.
Yeah, it's true that they did kind of arise at about the same time. And it's so interesting that William James figures prominently in both. He was an ardent spiritualist. I loved his one theory that in order to prove that there are white crows, you don't need to prove that all you need to do is prove the existence of one white crow. And that was part of what he believed, that if we could just prove one medium was real. And then, of course, you get people like Jung coming along, and Jung is into the idea of archetypes. He is not completely dismissing this as something that people aren't experiencing. He's just coming at it from a different direction. So, yeah, it certainly has had an odd and interesting relationship with psychology throughout the decades. And one of my kind of pet peeves with modern skeptics, and not always psychologists, but sometimes they are too quick to dismiss things that people experience as hallucinations, neurotic behavior, attention seeking, whatever. And I know too many people who I absolutely believe have experienced something to be that dismissive myself. I have not really experienced anything that I cannot explain, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I try to be a very open-minded skeptic. So my whole approach is something's happening, I just don't know what.
And you can see where psychologists would be fine with being like, well, we're not saying this isn't happening. Like, we still need to understand the person's experience of this. That just as other scientists are trying to figure out the invisible forces in the world, that some of these spiritualists are, psychologists are just taking a different angle and trying to understand what the experience is that people are having. Someone did ask whether you encountered any mediums that you would say were authentic. And I'm guessing because of what you just said, maybe not.
Let's put it this way. I know I'm friends with some mediums who I absolutely believe they are genuine in terms of their belief in their own abilities. I do not doubt for a second that they believe they are actually communicating with something beyond. I don't know what that is. I don't know what they're experiencing. It might be a psychological state. It might be, there have been a few experiments that have suggested that some people might be hardwired to respond to certain electromagnetic frequencies differently. Maybe when they are walking into one of these old buildings where the wiring is all funky, they're getting zapped by that. I don't know. I don't think anyone does right now, but I absolutely believe that some of them are genuine in at least what they think they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that really kind of comes across in the book, that is such a central part of understanding this or any kind of religion. It's not necessarily whether the author believes, it's whether you are willing to believe that these people believe. Because if you come at it from the approach of they were all charlatans, everyone was faking, everyone was lying, it actually becomes really hard to explain a lot of this. That even the people who are faking things in their spirit chamber, can still believe in all of this. And that it's hard to make sense of any of it if you don't allow for belief as a thing. And it is one of those things where you either allow for belief in spiritual things or you don't. You can't sort of be like, the 19th century is the place where it's sort of like you can't pick and choose which religions are the weird ones and which ones aren't, because 19th century America is full of real weird religions. And interesting that which ones kind of get gone after for debunking, and which ones don't. Let me see if we have a couple of others. Lorraine asks, medium versus psychic terminology.
That's a really good question, and there's a fairly easy pat answer to it, which is still a little bit vague, but the easy answer is mediums communicate with spirits of the dead and psychics can communicate with the living. So a psychic is someone who can look at you and say, oh, you are interested in finding out what your next job is going to be. Is that right? Whereas the medium is someone who can say, oh, your dad is here and would like to talk to you. Now, even those definitions sometimes just merge and become synonyms. I've heard them applied interchangeably, but if you talk to actual mediums or psychics, that's usually the definition they will give you.
Yeah, and I noted it because I thought it was such a good way of describing the question facing people who believed in this or who wanted to believe in it. That really these seances were seeking to understand, are disembodied spirits capable of corresponding with spirits that are embodied? That it was really about the corporeal and the non-corporeal world, whereas maybe a classic psychic would fall more in the mental telegraphy world of things. Maureen had asked a question, and I kept like looking for the book because I was like, I know this name is mentioned in there. She asks, she noted that Allan Kardec's grave in Paris is still so well cared for. He seems like a major figure in spiritualism at the same time you're talking about. And I was like, I remember him being in a really thorny paragraph about the differences between things. So I wonder if you can talk about him a little.
Yeah, boy, it's been a while since I wrote about him. He went under a couple of names, which is probably some of the confusion. But yeah, he had his own little sort of sidebar to spiritualism. He was kind of around the same time that Madame Blavatsky was, and they were both creating their own sort of versions of spiritualism. They might incorporate something like reincarnation. Madame Blavatsky wrote about these 7 masters that she claimed to have encountered, and Kardec was, I'm trying to remember now what all of Kardec's particular beliefs were.
So this was, he called his Spiritism,
right,
which is also what the Catholic Church called spiritualism, but it was totally different. He said that Spiritism was, he believed that unlike spiritualism, but akin to theosophy, promoted the doctrine of reincarnation, and unlike theosophy, but akin to spiritualism, held that spirits can interact with the earthly realm as they linger between physical bodies. And notably, like that he sort of like went and like talked to a bunch of mediums and was like, let's sort out what's real. That you know, he was revered as the codifier, that he was like, let's systematize all of this kind of stuff. So there's, I mean, this is just absolutely full of fascinating people, some of whom I was so excited to see the seer of Poughkeepsie end up in here. There are a lot of new and interesting people to learn about, and also a lot of people who you will know, who you maybe didn't know, kind of intersected with this world in really kind of surprising ways. And she really does take you all the way through a lot of interesting 20th century offshoots, and then some great stuff about the way that our contemporary ideas of seances have been shaped by popular culture. And I was fascinated. You talk about a movie, Spellbound, not the Spellbound that I was thinking of, a different one from the 40s, where it was censored in Britain in the 1940s because because they thought it would be offensive to spiritualists, which I thought was I actually went back up and was like, did I get the date wrong? That there was a worry of offending this religious group in the 1940s in Britain.
Yeah, and it's a very obscure movie. It's not a great movie, unfortunately, but it's interesting that the answer to that from the distributors was to add a prologue from a famous spiritualist. And unfortunately, there are no copies of the movie that exist now with that prologue, which I would love to hear spoken or see, or how they did it. But
yeah, no, I thought that just, you know, really showed the persistence of this and the way that it was understood as an important religious group to be understood and respected. The title of the movie is Spellbound, although I feel like it went by 3 other names. It's not the Hitchcock one. I'm not sure it's the Hitchcock one. It's a different one.
Right. It's not the Hitchcock one. Yeah.
No, I was like, that one we have,
right.
and we could see that. Is that the one with Gregory Peck in it? That's all about Freudian stuff. It's totally different, but yeah, there were 3 or 4 other names for this one. You will go down, and thank you to Nina, who's been dropping Wikipedia links in my browser at work. Was just like, you couldn't see the names of the tabs. I was looking up so many interesting characters in here, and you know, some really excellent, just William Lloyd Garrison understanding this as like, well, this is part of the New Jerusalem. You know, the way that this just fit into so many things that people were already thinking was, as I think one of the strongest parts of this is the way that it, I won't say normalizes, but like you can read this and understand why this was such a big thing, and so accessible and so welcoming to so many people. So thank you very much, Lisa, for chatting about this book with us, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight who gave me so many good questions to draw on. You can purchase a copy of the book through the museum store. If you do that, that does support the work that we do and helps us bring in more speakers. As I said, this should be up on YouTube in a couple of days for you to watch, but I do encourage you to get the book, to read, and to get Lisa's other books, because I think a lot of the things that you were asking about may pop up in some of her other writing. I know this is the third conversation with someone that Lisa has had today, so I appreciate your you still had a lot to give us, and we really, really appreciate it. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for asking such great questions, Erin. That was really much more fun than the usual things I get, like what scares you. So
Oh, I didn't even think to ask that.
thank you.
I was like, that's not even in the book anywhere. So excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and we'll see you here again soon for another discussion.
Thank you, and happy Halloween, everyone.
Absolutely.